All right, we are at 101, and as promised, I'll jump right in. So thanks all to everybody for joining us. I'm Jamil Jaffer, the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School. NSI was founded about 3 years ago with the idea of bringing a robust conversation about American national security to both an academic, a policymaking, student, and public audience. And part of that effort was to focus on a couple of specific issues for the year 2020, 2021. And so this year we've launched two major initiatives, our Countering China's Rise initiative and our Technology and Innovation and National Security initiative. This panel today is our second event in that latter series, Technology, Innovation, and Protecting American National Security. We're pleased today to host this conversation. And we've obviously seen a lot of discussion about the techlash that's happening on Capitol Hill and other things, whether it's encryption policy or our policy with respect to China or the like. And so we've got a very distinguished panel here today to talk about these issues. So let me start right at the top and talk about who's here with us today. Aaron Hughes, immediately to my left, at least on my screen, is an NSI advisory board member and the former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cyber Policy. In that role, Aaron oversaw the development and implementation of cyber policy strategies, operations, and plans in support of DoD efforts in cyberspace. As the senior civilian responsible for DoD activities in the cyber domain, he regularly engaged with the White House and departments and agencies across the U.S. government to assist in the formulation and review of whole-of-nation policies. He currently serves as VP of Information Security and the Deputy CISO of Capital One. Aaron, thanks for being here. Randy Milch is the co-chair of the NYU Center for Cybersecurity and the former general counsel of Verizon. At NYU, Randy serves as a distinguished fellow at the Reese Center, as a professor of practice at NYU School of Law, and as a faculty co-director of the Masters in Science in Cybersecurity Risk and Strategy. During his time at Verizon, Randy was responsible for national security matters beginning in 2006. He served as a senior cleared executive at Verizon and chaired the Verizon Executive Security Council, which oversaw information security across all of the Verizon entities. Dr. Sam Ravitch is the chairman of the FDD's Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation, as well as its Transformative Cyber Innovation Lab and the principal investigator on FDD's Cyber-Enabled Economic Warfare Project. In addition to work at FDD, Samantha serves as a commissioner on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, as a member of the Secretary of Energy's Advisory Board, and perhaps most importantly is the vice chair of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board. And last but certainly not least, Ron Gula is the moderator of our August panel today. Ron is an NSI Advisory Board member, also the president of Gula Tech Adventures. Prior to his work investing and advising cybersecurity companies, Ron served as the CEO and co-founder of Tenable Network Security, where he helped them scale to more than 20,000 customers worldwide and raised $300 million in venture capital, achieving revenues in excess of over $100 million annually. Ron began his career also in the U.S. government as a network penetration tester for the National Security Agency. So thanks all for being here. What an amazing panel. Ron, over to you. Take it away.
Thanks for those great introductions there, Jamil. So we have an August panel in August, right? And with that lame joke, we're going to talk about tackling the techlash. As we go on today, feel free to type your questions into the lower right Q&A thing in your Zoom panel, and I'll either read them in, and we're going to leave about 10, 15 minutes towards the end. So one of the things we're going to talk about today is some overall themes. So why is there a techlash? Why is it now? Who's feeling lashed against with the different types of technologies? So let's just kind of initially go around the horn and I want to hear everybody react to, what do you think when we say techlash, either the who or the why or the now? Samantha, let's go with you first.
Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. Leading up to this panel, when I was thinking about who and why and why now. First of all, yes, I do think that there is a techlash, and it's beyond just Capitol Hill. And I started to think about what are the similarities between kind of the color revolutions and what happened in the Middle East, in Turkey and Brazil in 2013, where a middle class that was actually part of the system kind of stood up and said, we want changes in our country. Right. And I went back and I looked at it. And again, these people were in the system, but they felt there was a lack of transparency, that they weren't getting what they were promised. And I kind of started to think, this is kind of what we're seeing and hearing now on a techlash. It's people that use technology, but feel like the big tech players are almost political actors, right? They can tax, they can deny me benefits. I don't have transparency into how they do that. And so there's this kind of bubbling up from the users of technology to want to change the kind of equation. So I think that there's a lot to pull there. And let me just say one other thing about this WHO. You know, when you look back at history in terms of what happened in Turkey and Brazil and before that in the Arab world, where it was led by the middle class, those revolutions didn't work. And one reason is because they didn't have a broader coalition. So it'd be interesting to see whether there is actually a push, this techlash actually becomes something that constrains these big tech players.
Thank you. Aaron, what are your thoughts on techlash as a concept?
Yeah, thank you, Ron. Thank you, Jamil. So certainly agree with Samantha. There's absolutely a techlash going on. If you think of every company, every industry, you know, one of the constant refrains is sort of this digital transformation and digital disruption from, you know, industries that maybe hadn't traditionally needed to interact, you know, globally or through the internet in some way, shape, or form. You know, now that is sort of commonplace, and with the big tech players owning so much of that ecosystem, owning so much of the engagement point with consumers, the power of the big companies like Google, Amazon, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, is tremendous. And the level of protection that they're putting in that customer data, or the level of engagement they have with the US government or companies trying to leverage their services as a means to interact, is something that we'll certainly discuss through the course of conversation today.
Excellent, excellent. And Randy, what are your thoughts on techlash?
Ron, thank you again, and thank you, Jamil. You know, I think that it's the question of how technology has all of a sudden become the canvas on which the political parties can now write their dream campaigns, right? So for some on the left, it's technology is too big. Why isn't the antitrust laws destroying these behemoths? On the right, there's now all sorts of problems with Section 230 and transparency and censorship, all sorts of issues there. But it allows them, as Samantha, you know, recently pointed out, is this just by coincidence strange bedfellows against the big tech companies, right? For very separate reasons, but it's politically expedient at this point for everyone to forget that the accretion of growth in the tech companies was almost at every step approved by our antitrust agencies in both Republican and Democratic administrations. The Section 230, you know, is a Clinton era creation that has become the, you know, the most important, you know, it's the 26 words that created the internet to mimic someone's book title. So, you know, as someone who I distinctly recall many years of going to Capitol Hill and telling senators that Google and Facebook and Twitter were not your friends, that they are dangerous, they're inherently dangerous entities. And the answer I always got, which of course pissed me off, was, well, you're just from the you're just from the telephone company. You're just pissed at them because you're from the telephone company. I actually finally got some apologies from some elected officials privately, of course, that you know, after a certain point, they sort of said, wow, you know, they aren't the nicest people in the world, and nor should they be expected to be, right? They're companies, they have business imperatives and the like. So I think that we're at a interesting political moment, and it'll be interesting to see how the grassroots issues that Samantha pointed out, whether they actually catch fire enough to propel, you know, the legislative changes that would be necessary in order to change things, right? We're talking about a lot of change that would have to be different than what we've experienced in the past.
Yeah. Ron, can I just add one thing on that, which is, you had asked also why now? I mean, I think the why now, you know, part of this conversation is fairly obvious because, You know, we're all in our living rooms, you know, wearing flip-flops, working on platforms, talking about, you know, all of these issues. In my government hat, you know, working on these platforms from, you know, from my home. Is my home network really secure? Who knows? So the why now is, I think it's opened so many people's eyes. So another phrase I'm trying to popularize is, I think we've become technologically woke. And but you know, there's something to that. Like, we are really recognizing the primacy of this technology for how we make our money, how we get our food, how we get our medicine. It is so pervasive, and COVID just kind of really drove it home.
Yeah, it's a great point. I definitely agree that COVID not only made everybody feel more connected, but then they realized online that connectivity that they weren't appreciating, they very much appreciate it now. All right, so the first big question, we'll go to Aaron with this one. So big tech, you know, we all think of Google, Twitter, Facebook, but I kind of put Verizon and the financial industry, Capital One, I kind of put that in there. So big tech, do they take citizen data, and I say citizen data, talk about US citizen, do they take it for granted? Aaron.
So they're certainly monetizing it. And I think with that, it would lead me to believe they take it extremely seriously, their sort of right and need to protect it. Now, that hasn't always, you know, played itself out in terms of, you know, what we see as consumers and leakages of data and otherwise, but sort of given the importance of consumer trust in their platforms, consumer trust in the data, in some instances, the confidentiality or the efficacy through whatever processes you're interacting with, I want to believe they all take that sort of extremely seriously. I mean, I'll speak, you know, in Capital One, we absolutely take that, the premise of data protection seriously. And in big tech, again, given the importance to, you know, their platforms, their services, and I think sort of the future. I mean, I want to tie it back to maybe even a point that Samantha was just making a section ago, related to the inflection point that the quarantine and COVID has led us to. Like, we're not going back to a period in time where many more industries are interacting, you know, through mechanisms like we're on today and through a much more digital means. I think the data protections become even more important long term. And, you know, I do believe, which maybe will be different than some of my panelists, that sort of big tech takes that that privilege and that access seriously.
I've got a couple follow-up questions to this, but Randy and Samantha, any comments on does big tech take private citizen data seriously?
You know, I think my only addition to what Aaron said, is that if you look at big tech, it actually depends on where you look in the company about how seriously they take citizen data. You know, it's not unusual. The tech wannabes are full of marketeers who say, God, if I only had all that data, I can come up with a product that, you know, will be the next unicorn, right? And most of the time that doesn't work out. You know, and so you really have to, depends on where you look, I think. You know, for every Aaron that there is who has dedicated his life to protecting data, I'm afraid you have a lot of people who don't really spend that much time thinking about the protection of data. And part of the problem is we don't have any rules, and I don't mean like a privacy law or cybersecurity. We don't have like general corporate rules that drive people to take care of this data, right? It's not an asset on their books. It's not a liability on their books. They don't have you know, they don't have data retention programs that target this sort of alt data the way that the financial world thinks of it, which is not, you know, basic corporate data. So I think that there's a lot missing in the kind of thing that would drive the attention in a corporation more broadly.
Yeah, so I really like the comments of Aaron and Randy. You know, one of the things that Aaron said, you know, which is, well, you know, they should be taking it seriously because they're monetizing it. You know, you wonder, well, if it's pushed where they can't monetizing it, then, I mean, are they going to take it even less seriously? Because I do think that, as we all know, cybersecurity is not hard-baked. It's an overlay at best. And so a couple things from you mentioned the Cyber Solarium Commission, 3 of the recommendations. I mean, one is a recommendation on a national data security and privacy protection law, establishing and standardizing requirements for the collection, retention, and sharing of user data. A second is a national breach notification law, which is in the House version of the NDAA. And a third, which hasn't gotten traction yet, but I'm hopeful at some point it will, which is to amend the Sarbanes-Oxley, to have cybersecurity be one of the things that boards and C-suites have to certify, on a standard, in a standard way. But those would get the recognition that I think Randy was talking about.
Yeah.
I think that one of the points that I heard also that's important is it's inconsistent by industry, right? Highly regulated industries, banking, maybe some interactions with the government, sort of have different, laws and regulations as it relates to that data. I think as we get sort of, more bifurcated, spread out, federated in terms of industries and laws, I think that's where we need some common standards around how the data is protected.
Well, speaking of double standards, so to speak, how do you guys react? And let's start with Randy this time. But how do you react to perhaps somebody like a Google choosing to work with the government of China to enhance AI versus ignoring or not working with the Pentagon to do AI for U.S. interest?
Well, I don't react to it well. I think that it's, they're not required to be consistent, but I do think that companies need at bottom to figure out where they're from. Companies say, "Oh, we're a global company. We have interests all over the world. We have people. We have assets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." And that's well and good. That's really well and good. But sometimes it hits the fan, and when it hits the fan, you need to know where you're really a company of. And I think that when we are in horse races with other companies with other countries for very, very strategic and important technology, that it behooves a company at the very senior levels to say, hey, we wouldn't exist without the United States. We wouldn't exist without the freedoms that we have. And to sort of say, I'm not going to do it because my employees don't like it, because I don't trust the government, any number of things. And by the way, those are all important. And not trusting the government is something that I think that any senior person in a company has to be skeptical about their interactions with the government, particularly on the secure side of the house. But I think that you need to know where you're from. And I think there are too many Silicon Valley companies, tech companies, that have forgotten where they're from.
Samantha, any comments on the double standard with China?
Yeah, I think that the company and the employees that pushed for canceling the contract with the Pentagon are at best intellectually lazy, right? They're akin to finding their car keys in the light of the street lamp. They know, because of our open press, because of our transparency, about the military, about the U.S. military, about our foreign policy, and they like it or they don't like it. In this case, they don't like it. But where are the questionings of the brutal detention of the Uyghurs, of the plight of the Tibetans, about the fact that Huawei has sold surveillance capabilities to 49 countries to repress and oppress their people? Where is any of that kind of the next step of understanding what the world looks like and who are adversaries? So the kindest thing I can say about those decisions and what those employees, sign their name to, is that they are intellectually lazy. I could go much further than that.
We need a Techlash name for that. So Aaron, next question to you. So is Twitter and Facebook, are they doing enough to prevent the spread of disinformation? And even in some cases, like, Joe Biden's Twitter account getting owned, the direct spoofing of information potentially. Are they doing enough?
Well, let me just make a comment on the previous point on Google real quick. I'll just state from someone that was formerly in the department. I just don't get it. Like, the department needs access to the best and brightest. Google asserts that it has those type of engineers. So that one just always baffled me. In terms of Facebook and Twitter, I know that they're certainly trying, but as we can see from sort of continued active disinformation, they're not succeeding at it. I appreciate the transparency that Facebook has had in trying to mute those disinformation campaigns. I appreciate what Twitter has tried to do for where they have sort of either removed or stated that tweets were not factually correct. But Twitter, in this day and age of the platform that it provides for so many global leaders, including sort of our own president, like, that should be viewed in my mind as sort of a national security asset. Like, the efficacy of a platform that can put out policy that can move markets, we need much more protection and control around the information that is prevalent on that platform. And so the answer in my mind is no, they're not doing enough. Certainly they're trying, and to the degree that they need additional partnerships with other entities to sort of help move that along, I'd be extremely supportive of that, because we are in a day and age where we need a platform of truth, and that just does not exist on either of those as currently constituted.
Yeah, I'm going to get everybody's comments on this, but Randy, would you mind just taking a moment as I think the only lawyer on the panel? Is that true, right? Nobody's else a secret lawyer? Okay, great. Could you just talk about for a brief minute or two why Twitter, Facebook aren't considered publishers, why they can do what they can do, why they get caught up in this whole censorship debate? Like, what governs that?
So as part of the Communications Decency Act, which was part of the Telecom Act of '96, the famous Section 230 was passed. It had two very basic parts to it. One part basically said that providers of the kind of service that interaction computer service, the kind of service that Twitter and Facebook are, those services can't be held liable as a publisher for things that third parties put on their platform. So that was a very important shield for them. So that's the first part, right? That you can't accuse them of the basic idea was defamatory speech, but the courts have very, very broadly interpreted that protection. So it's protected them from cyber stalking claims, and a whole measure of various types of claims can't be brought against them. The second part of it was that they also got immunity for curating the content, right? So not only did they get immunity they couldn't be sued for what third parties put on, but if they took steps to curate the content, they also couldn't be sued. And so it was two parts, right? One, and the expectation, the clause was called the Good Samaritan Clause. So the expectation was that these platforms that had so much third-party content on them would, because of these two protections, spend their time curating the content so that bad things didn't show up, right? They couldn't be sued for them, but bad things didn't show up because they couldn't be sued for taking them off. Now, the truth of the matter is that since from '96 on, you can sort of count it, there were basically 2 decades of relying entirely on the first part of that protection, i.e. you can't sue me for anything that comes on my platform, and very little time spent on the second part, right? Which is, I'm going to curate things off. Other than child pornography, which was a very obvious and important separate mandate that they had under federal law, there was very little work on that part. So in some ways, the huge size of these platforms got ahead of their capabilities to deal with the things that appeared on them. And now we're in a very big catch-up period. And unfortunately, we're in a catch-up period where the platforms are damned if they do and damned if they don't, right? They're damned if they actually rely on their immunities. People say, oh, you don't care. On the other hand, if they try to curate things and take things off, as human beings are going to be doing it, because machine learning is not yet up to the task of really doing it well. Human beings are going to make these decisions. Human beings are biased. There's going to be bias probably in how they take things off, and they're damned on that front. So that's sort of the legal framework, and that's sort of a little bit of the factual aspect to it, at least up to this point.
Excellent, excellent. So Samantha, could you comment also on, are they doing enough to prevent disinformation, but then segue towards the balance for censorship?
Yeah, again, in some ways, I think that the tech companies aren't doing enough. On the other hand, they're private entities going against nation state actors, right? And so I think we also have to be aware of that. The Cybersecurity Commission, our recommendations fell into 3 buckets. One is shape behavior, meaning working with our international partners. The second was increasing resilience, and the third is being able to impose costs. And so when you look at things, like the big platforms being used for disinformation, well, the first 2 parts, the shaping behaviors and the resiliency, certainly there are things that they could do more, and there are ways the U.S. government can help them. But they're constrained from imposing costs. The U.S. government does not want letters of marque and reprisal. Over to you, attorney. So the tech companies are like, hey, at the end of the day, isn't it the U.S. government's responsibility to impose costs on a nation state adversary that is targeting our platforms and putting disinformation on it? So I think, again, that's where this all gets a little bit sticky. But in terms of the second part of your question, which is, what protections can be afforded the population, right? And oftentimes in some of these discussions, the populace is kind of left out of it. And again, that kind of goes back to my original comments. They're a constituency, and the Cybersecurity Commission, we spent a lot of time, focused on how can we strengthen their voice, their constituency, whether it is pass an Internet of Things security law, or establish and fund a national cybersecurity certification and labeling authority, or even establish liability for final goods assemblers. Right. And so those things were debated because we just felt that the consumer, the individual, the citizen was being left out of this conversation.
Excellent, excellent. So we're going to shift towards personal technology for the second half of this. We've got some great questions queued up. I will get to them. So if you're listening and you've got a question that we haven't touched yet, go free to type it. So Aaron, let's talk about personal technology. Does the average citizen really care about or know the difference between real privacy, end-to-end encryption, or legal law enforcement access to the data?
Does the average citizen care about it or know that it exists? I think the average citizen probably knows that it exists. I don't think that the average citizen, necessarily cares about the application of those sorts of capabilities or services. The average citizen wants to interact with the supercomputer that's in his or her pocket in the form of a phone, and wants their apps to work. And they want some semblance of their information to be held private to themselves and whoever they choose to share it with. I think, private citizens, if there are instances where their data is exposed or they're, become part of a legal matter, then then certainly they care a little bit more at that point in time. But I do not believe that the average citizen, would enter into, I think, the debate that we're about to get into right now.
That's right. Randy, what are your thoughts on legal law enforcement access to encrypted data, private data, the role of all that keeping us safe?
Well, I think that it's important to think of it in a few different buckets, unfortunately. If you're talking about the ability of law enforcement to get into something encrypted on a phone or on a PC that's sitting there in storage, I would think there's one set of issues that come up. If you're talking about the ability of law enforcement to intercept live traffic that might be end-to-end encrypted, I think there's a different set of concerns. The going dark debate, which is what you're really raising here, has been a mainstay of government technology interaction ever since a law called CALEA passed back in the 90s. So, and earlier, the whole notion of moving to digital switching in the phone business was accompanied by a law that basically required the phone companies to develop their technology in a way so that the ability of law enforcement to continue to intercept phone calls was unimpeded, right? That doesn't apply to the tech companies. It doesn't apply to the big internet companies. So the big technology platform companies, doesn't apply to Apple. So, you've got this sort of long-standing debate. Every director of the FBI for the last 30 years has stood up and said, we're going dark, it's going to be a problem. And there's been a chorus on the other side saying, no, it's not a problem. You get what you need when you really need it. And where the truth lies there, I honestly don't know. I honestly don't know, because I stopped doing that stuff 5 years ago, so I don't know what the truth is now. I do think that it's the thing that's a little bit different is that this used to be centered entirely on sort of the infrastructure, the internet companies, the infrastructure companies and the like. But now, given, as you said, Ron, and the ubiquity of important data that resides digitally so far across the spectrum of U.S. companies, this is something that every company's got to think about. Every company's going to have to think about what's their approach toward getting a subpoena for data. How are they storing that data? How is it being transported? All that kind of stuff. If you're not thinking about it, it could be a travel agency. It's definitely the finance companies, right? That's been true for years, but it's travel agencies, booksellers, you name it. And if they haven't thought about what they're going to do with their data, they should, because it's the huge growth of data everywhere, personal data everywhere, also means there's lots of different places for law enforcement and national security agencies to look for data. So many more people are in this mix, many more types of companies are in this mix than it used to be, where it was a pretty specialized cadre of companies and lawyers and national security people all knew each other, all were trying to work it out one way or the other, consistent with their equities. It's a much bigger pie now.
And Samantha, when I got my first copy of the Solarium, I read through it avidly looking for any recommendation on this issue. So what's your feelings on government access to data at rest and encryption? And then maybe can you give us any insight to some of the debate on the Solarium? Because
it was an honest, involved, in-depth debate. Probably I don't want to say contentious, because, for those who are listening, you understand about the Cyber Solarium Commission, 4 sitting members of Congress, 6 outsiders, of whom I was one, 4 sitting members of the executive branch. We had 30 meetings, each meeting 2 hours. 3 out of 4, at least, of the members of Congress were at every single meeting. It really was an astounding body to be participating in. Couldn't tell who was on what side of the aisle, completely nonpartisan. This issue, though, was contentious, and it didn't break down on party lines, all right? But it was contentious, because as you walk through the issue, right, and you start with, well, look, just think about how much data of yours personally, so you're an individual, is flowing across these devices. And now let's put on top what, the future of the Internet of Things, and, your health data, and how you run your house and your finances and all this stuff, right? And wow, we'd be so much more secure, end-to-end encryption. Right? Wow, our data can be so much more secure. And as an individual, you're saying, yeah, that sounds good. And then you're told, and if everybody had their data secure, we'd be much more secure as an economy, as a population, national security. That sounds fantastic. And then someone says, yes, and who else would be secure? A lawless, there'd be growing within our midst, basically ungoverned territory. Right? Ungoverned legal territory, child pornographers, human traffickers, money launderers, because, hey, guess what? They have the protections too of end-to-end encryption. And then as an individual, you're like, what am I willing to give up as my individual security for a societal, perhaps, security of mandatory lawful access, right? No one, get a subpoena and, show cause and go for it. We as a commission put down both sides. We did not come up with a recommendation. Frankly, it is something we punted on because hopefully technology will figure out a way to get us out of this. But as you walk on one side, then the other side of the debate, and then back to that first side, you feel torn within yourself as an individual that wants to protect my own data. And what do we need to do to govern our society? Because let me just add one other thing. Nothing else in our society do you have an absolute right. You can't have a safe in your house that you say, this is off limits. Like, I don't care what you do in the courts. You'll never get a subpoena to come into my house and look in that safe. I mean, I'll defer to Randy, but I don't think there is any guarantee that, that you could have that if the law enforcement can show cause and get a warrant to go look in that safe. So again, one side, other side, and then back to the first one.
Excellent. So we've been talking a lot. We've been beating up on social media companies and the government and whatnot, but let's just talk about tech in general. I want to go around the horn and Randy, we'll start with you. The constant barrage of upgrades. If you don't upgrade, you're a Luddite because you're on an iPhone 6, right? The computers that need to be patched and rebooted constantly, right? The Tesla, I got to bring it in to get an update, right? It never ends. And we have a public who's constantly frustrated why things aren't working and the constant obsolescence. So Randy, where are we going to be? What's going on here?
Well, I don't think that we're going to be free of Patch Tuesday or Patch Thursday. I never remember which day it is, which day it is, but
it's patch every day.
Patch every day. I don't think we're going to be free of that for quite some time. There's a lot of economic reasons why you want to get your software out as quickly as possible. First mover advantages, network effects, all those lock-in, customer lock-in. I mean, there's all sorts of economic reasons, economic incentives, and there's no real incentive on the other side to make sure your software is as close to perfect as it can be, right? There's no liability. Everything, you sign away all your liability every time you download it. I think that it's not going to change anytime soon. And I don't think that we have a system that really permits people to know that they've got some lemon before they've got it. Right? There's no rating system. There's people don't want to wait for the thing. Sometimes the download is pushed to you. If you have an iPhone, you get the pushes and you can let it sit there for a while, but it nags you. It says, oh, there's an update. Why? And they said, every update says important security update, right? So kind of a fool doesn't download an important security update, right? I mean, I think that's pretty significant. I will say that it's complicated. I mean, these are very complex systems. As Aaron said, this is just a supercomputer in your pocket. So it's not like it's simple. It's not simple. And anyone who runs like Aaron does, worries about a big system, knows that you can't patch it automatically, right? You never know what your patch is going to break in a complicated system. So you have to spend time looking at the patch, making sure it doesn't break something downstream, making sure all your systems work together after you've implemented the patch. So it's not uncomplicated. I think people I basically tell people, get over it. Why do you expect it to work better than, why do you expect it to work so well? It's complicated.
Aaron,
this is one, I think, you put your consumer hat on for a second and you say, okay, is this better than the alternative of having a bricked, piece of equipment because I can't patch the software and then it is, vulnerable in perpetuity? I think certainly as companies and entities, we can work on the usability associated with pushing the patches and making it more sort of seamless and making it so my grandmother can understand what's happening when she gets those alerts. But I don't think we would ever want to go back to a paradigm where there's not the ability to actively push corrections to software. I mean, I think that would increase your software costs, or increase your hardware costs for consumers. Certainly, we need to work on usability, but in the communication around why you need or want to install the software upgrade. But I think we're sort of, as an industry, I'm using industry in the terms of the tech industry, I think we're very much on the right track to making that more seamless.
Excellent. Samantha, any comments on the constant upgrades?
Yeah, the Cybersecurity Commission did recommend that Congress fund 3 critical technology security centers. One for the testing of security of hardware, one for the testing of security of software, and one for the testing of industrial control systems. We'll see whether this goes ahead, but I think not just relying on the companies to do it themselves, but to have the government also help in the testing, so that, Aaron's grandmother, my 91-year-old mother, can look at what the government says. Hey, this is necessary. This isn't. Because I was thinking the other day, you're right. My mom has an iPhone, and I was thinking her iPhone is probably more powerful than when I started at RAND in 1992. They had a Cray. Right? And, you wouldn't have my mom going in and upgrading the Cray. And yet, she's supposed to know about, downloading what patches and how on her iPhone. That's just nonsensical.
So along these lines, the government's trying to get more involved with this kind of awareness and public guidance. Like even the Solarium had a couple of recommendations that holding people liable, holding certain technologies ratings, which I thought was good. But we're increasingly seeing the National Security Agency getting involved. They're out and out talking about what vulnerabilities are being exploited. And most recently, they kind of came out just days after President Trump kind of banned TikTok and said, be careful when you're walking around with your Bluetooth and your Wi-Fi and certain types of apps. So it's getting kind of scary. Randy, any thoughts on this trend here?
Well, listen, if you look across the landscape of the government and how the government tries to impart information to folks, I guess we thought that things were going to be concentrated a little bit in the Department of Homeland Security, at CISA. I guess we thought that the FTC, which really does act as the principal cybersecurity commercial, consumer cybersecurity regulator in the country, would be doing more, but we don't have an approach that's really, we don't have a single bully pulpit. My own view is that there's a little bit of there unfortunately is at certain times with the government, with the current government, a little bit of confusion about whether we're being told that a national security problem is really a national security problem, or maybe have more political aspects to it. And I'm not saying it's only this administration, but it certainly seems to be an issue with this administration. So you can understand that people are a little hesitant to say, well, is this truth, or is there politics behind it? That being said, folks at the NSA are pretty smart. And by the way, advice about the fact that you're leaving open communications entryways into your devices by leaving your Bluetooth on and the like. I mean, that's pretty accurate. There's no reason to doubt that that's the case. So I guess I'm currently in favor of, if we're not going to consolidate into a single bully pulpit, which I think would be a good idea about getting information out to folks from the government about cybersecurity, sort of on the GCHQ model in Britain, then I guess I'm in favor of as many pulpits as we've got to tell people information, because the general level of cybersecurity awareness, the general level of cybersecurity hygiene in the country is very low. We are barely in the hand washing phase of hygiene, cyber hygiene. So I'm in favor of as much information as possible.
Excellent. Samantha or Aaron, any comments? Aaron?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's not lost on any of us as panelists here, or likely the community listening, that NSA has an offensive and a defensive mission. They're also across U.S. government, widely respected for their technical acumen. Now, I think there's probably some pockets of the broader country that are cynical around NSA's intentions, but I think sort of as a citizen, I want sort of one of our more technically respected entities, providing technical advice on how to protect yourself. Similar to Randy, should that be centralized in some way, shape, or form, in DHS or other organizations? I think we want as many parts of the USG that are involved with protecting citizen data, company data, critical infrastructure to sort of espouse the principles of how to protect yourself and your company. So I'm absolutely supportive of NSA pushing that message out there, obviously acknowledging that they have a prime defensive mission for government systems.
Excellent. Any comments on the NSA and TikTok and whatnot, Samantha?
Well, yeah, so, on TikTok, I think that it would also be good, and probably NSA isn't the right one to do this piece of kind of the context, right? I mean, NSA should be looked to for their technological acumen, and when they put out warnings and they provide the technological reasons for these warnings, people should heed them. But they're the broader context of something like, TikTok. Why we shouldn't be comfortable with the fact that China says, no, don't worry, all data from TikTok, in the US remains in the US until it doesn't the next day, and then it can go back to China, and of course the Chinese Communist Party can get any of that data that it wants. At the point when there was an American head of TikTok US, until there isn't. Those broader context of how and why China may want to use this data, get more people dependent on it, because the other thing in terms of context for TikTok, let's not forget, like 10 years or whatever it is ago, Facebook was simply a platform to hook up with your former high school boyfriend or girlfriend. That was it, right? And over the last decade, the amount of data that Americans have allowed Facebook to have, the ways that Facebook is being used, people have become dependent on it for understanding their politics, understanding, what's going on in their broader society. You wouldn't want to see TikTok, which now people are like, it's a 15-second video, become a platform of choice, still held by China, but being able to kind of vacuum up more and more of American data. And I think that was the broader context around it. Which again, isn't for NSA to really provide. It might be for other American agencies.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we've got some great questions from the audience. I'm sure you guys are going to give some great answers. So let's try to do this as quickly as possible. About 15 of these queued up. So the first question is, do the AI algorithm, do the machine learning algorithms that are created by flawed humans, doing things that we're not going to be able to undo? What are your general thoughts on these things? And we're using AI to decide if we make loans, to drive cars, to fly drones. Is there a risk in not trusting these algorithms?
Of course, there's certainly a risk in bias in all these algorithms, right? I mean, it's well established. You have to ask two questions. One is, what are the efficiencies gained by using AI to do some things and not? And secondly, remember, there's bias in humans. So if AI wasn't doing this, you'd have a different set of humans than the developers who get bias, who allow unconscious bias into the AI, into the algorithms. You'd have a different set of humans making the decisions themselves, right? So some of our first AI implementations were in things like parole questions and the like, bail questions, parole questions, ideas about future dangerousness and the like. And there were certainly biases that were exploited in these. The question then became, okay, but the idea was to replace the judge who was biased. So you always have to ask in these questions, better than what, right? It's one of the most critical questions about new technology is better than what? What's it replacing? Is it, by the way, that doesn't mean you should let people off the hook. I mean, I think that the AI and machine learning is in its infancy in figuring out ways to root out bias, whether there's a whole thing about explainable AI, imposing some sort of almost a requirement that the algorithms be explainable. This at the same time when people who develop them basically say they're black boxes by nature and they're not going to be explainable. So there's a lot of back and forth on this. I think it's too early to call AI hopelessly biased and unable. This horse is well out of the barn, and so we're going to have to do a lot of catch up. And maybe the answer is there are just certain uses we don't allow AI for because we're not, instead of trying to make it better or trying to explain it or trying to overregulate it, maybe we just decide there's some uses that we're not going to use AI for, and we're going to use AI for other uses, right? We don't have to be captive to AI yet. I mean, obviously one day we're all going to be captive to AI because it's going to be hovering above us in a big machine. But until then, we can decide not to use it in certain places.
Aaron, next question for you. Is there such a thing as Lawlash? So we're talking about Techlash, but are there laws coming out of the Brussels and Washington, D.C., GDPR, the right to be forgotten, so many things. Is this creating a barrier for innovation?
Well, I might have to throw a lifeline to Randy on the legal side. Not that I have seen. I mean, certainly we're having to ensure that our technologies adhere to those laws and regulations, but it has not sort of stopped, companies from moving forward and continuing to engage with consumers. I don't think it is. Now we've had to apply more resources, more capacity, higher costs. So maybe entrance into the market that has stifled some innovation, but probably, not for bigger corporations.
Cool.
And I think that Aaron just accurately explained why it's a barrier to entry why regulation is traditionally seen as a barrier to entry to small companies. And there's little, between the various regulatory regimes, the overlapping regulatory regimes that we have now on cyber and privacy. I think that there is a risk that these regimes that, Michael Nelson's question from Carnegie is a good question. I think that there is a real danger that, there is already a regulatory overlay that's a burden on companies. Whenever you have a big company that says, please come regulate me, the way that Facebook did, you got to think, it's because Facebook's got more money than God and can afford to be regulated.
Excellent. Samantha, next question's for you. I think I know who this is from, but it's, as a Silicon Valley VC who cares about national security, I am often dismayed by the low level of technology knowledge among legislators. The Solarium Commission was a breath of fresh air. Who are the think tanks that are respected by Congress and who are able to bridge the tech knowledge gap for policymakers? And if you could, give a shout out to some of the congressmen and senators who are on the commission, please.
Yeah, that would be my pleasure. The 4 members of Congress, Angus King was one of the co-chairs, independent from Maine, Ben Sass, senator from Nebraska, the other co-chair from the House, Mike Gallagher from Wisconsin, and the wonderful Jim Langevin, congressman from Rhode Island. These members of Congress, again, 3 out of 4 mostly, came to every single meeting and worked the hard issues. They asked the right questions. They were head down in learning things that they didn't know about. And one of the the kind of most disruptive recommendations from the commission, I don't think its time is right now, is the formation of a select committee on the Hill for cyber, similar to what CISI and HIPSI are for intelligence, so that you could have a dedicated staff that are experts, that you could have members that are willing to dedicate the time to become, build up a body of expertise. Representative Jim Langevin was just a trooper on trying to push this ahead. It's tough haul at this point because it runs into so many jurisdictions. Again, it's not partisan. That's not the reason why it probably won't succeed at this point in time. It's because try asking members of Congress to give up some jurisdiction. That gets a little tough. Different parts on the think tank side, different parts of the equation. The one, Suzanne Spalding, who is on the commission at CSIS, is doing phenomenal work on election security. My own think tank on the Center for Cyber and Technology Innovation, we look at technological pilot projects to try to understand why doesn't good technology transition to help protect the defense industrial base, thinking that we have to kind of pre-chew food to say, this is blockchain, it does not mean cryptocurrency, this is what it looks like, don't be afraid, it isn't black magic, it can just make your ledgers more secure, things like that. So there are a number of great work being done, but again, www.solarium.gov. At least read the co-chair's report letter, 2 pages at the beginning.
And of course, the National Security Institute helped out a little bit with that.
Yes, of course. Oh my God, I should be mortified.
All right, so last question, and then we're going to go because we're about the top of the hour here. And Samantha's going to go last, okay, on this one because you've been doing this for a while. So, Aaron, the election's over. You get a phone call, says, I need 2 minutes of advice for the next administration on cyber for the state. What would you recommend?
I'll put my old hat on and say, get out of DOD's way, right? Let's not sort of over legislate or over sort of EO the ability for the department to do what we've been trying to mature for so long. Now, I think there's certainly been progress on that in the 4 years that I've been outside of the Pentagon, but I will certainly champion DOD efforts to make sure that we can appropriately defend forward and impose costs as appropriate in collaboration with all the other dimensions that we have at our disposal.
Awesome. Randy, any recommendations for the next administration?
I would double down on critical infrastructure to the detriment of private consumer cybersecurity. I think is in the near term, I'm much more concerned about private infrastructure. I think until we have a population that actually values its privacy, which I don't think we have now, I think we're frittering away resources, beating up on that more. And I'm much more concerned about the 16 or 17 critical infrastructure categories than I am about individual cyber.
And Samantha, I think you guys recommended, was it 87 unique things?
Right, but so look in the report.
Top three.
Oh, well, continuity of the economy, because no matter how resilient we need to become, we obviously need to defend forward. We need to be able to impose costs, but there is a high likelihood we will suffer a significant cyber attack. And the greatest deterrent is that the adversary knows that we will not be down for the count, that we can get up the next day and strike back, meaning that our economy, in the interconnected way that it is, that we know how to flow resources and capabilities to telecom. Not everyone is going to be prioritized. What does telecommunications need to get up and running? What do the banks need to get up and running first and foremost, as well as prioritizing parts of the critical infrastructure? So folks can go in the report and look at that recommendation.
Excellent. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for this, and I want to turn it back over to Jamil Jaffer. Jamil, I think we had a really good showing here.
Awesome, Ron. What a great conversation. Aaron, Samantha, Randy, thanks for being here. Really appreciate it. Thanks to all the attendees for joining. Just a couple of quick items. Upcoming next week, Ambassador Ruben Brigady, the ambassador to the U.S. to the African Union, will be on with us on NATSEC Nightcap. There's a link to that in your chat box. In addition, Randy Shriver will be chatting in our NSI 2020 series on China with Bethany Allen Ebrahimian, the China reporter for Axios. So please join us. There will be a survey at the end of it. Take 2 minutes to fill it out. We really appreciate your support. Please join us. Thanks again to the panel. Really appreciate it. Have a great afternoon, everybody.